Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. This is a novel translated by Michael Hoffman. This is part 5 of 5 parts. Hopefully you read the first 4 parts with Jimmy. Ready? We left off in the last part 4 with the tenants that had now started renting from Gregor's family's apartment. The tenants inclined themselves to the dishes in front of them as though to examine them before eating, and the one who was sitting at the head of the table and who seemed to have some authority over the others cut into the piece of meat in the dish as though to check whether it was sufficiently done. That's where we left off. You ready? Let's go. Last part. Aren't you excited? He seemed content with what he found, and the mother and sister, who had been watching in some trepidation, broke into relieved smiles. The family were taking their meal in the kitchen. But even so, before going in there, the father came in and with a single reverence, cap in hand, walked once around the table. All the tenants got up and muttered something into their beards, and once they were on their own again, they ate in near silence. And it struck Gregor that out of all the various sounds that one could hear, it was that of their grinding teeth that stood out, as though to demonstrate to Gregor that teeth were needed to eat, and the best toothless gums were of no use. But I do have an appetite, Gregor said to himself earnestly, not only for those things, but the way those tenants fill their boots while I am left here to starve. On that same evening, Gregor couldn't recall having heard the violin once in all this time. It sounded from the kitchen. The tenants had finished their supper. The one in the middle had produced a newspaper and given the other two a page apiece, and now they were leaning back, reading, smoking. But when the violin sounded, they pricked up their ears, and they got up and they tiptoed through the door of the hallway where they stayed pressed together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, because the father called out, "Do you gentlemen have any objection to the music? It can be stopped right away." "Well, on the contrary," said the middle gentleman, "mightn't the young lady like to come in and play for us here, where it's more cozy and convenient?" "Only too happy to oblige," called the father, as if he were the violin player himself. The gentlemen withdrew to their dining room, and they waited. And before long stepped the father with the musical stand, the mother with the score, and the sister with the violin. Calmly, the sister set everything up in readiness, and the parents, they never rented rooms before, and therefore overdid politeness toward the tenants. They didn't even dare to sit in their own chairs. Gregor's father leaned in the doorway, his right hand pushed between the 2 buttons of his overcoat. And Gregor's mother was offered a seat by one of the gentlemen, and not presuming to move, remained sitting just where the gentleman had put her, off in the corner. The sister began to play. Father, mother, each on their respective sides, attentively followed the movements of her hands. Gregor, drawn by the music, had slowly inched forward, and his head was already in the living room. He was no longer particularly surprised at his lack of discretion, where previously this discretion had been his entire pride, even though now he would have had additional cause to remain hidden because a result of the dust and lay everywhere in his room and it flew up at the merest movement. He himself was covered with dust. On his back, along his sides, he dragged around an assortment of threads, hairs, bits of food. His indifference to everything was far too great for him to lie down on his back, as he had done several times a day before, to rub himself clean on the carpet. And in spite of his condition, Gregor felt no shame at moving out onto the pristine floor of the living room. Uh-oh. Admittedly, no one paid him any regard. The family was completely absorbed by the violin playing, and the tenants, on the other hand, hands in pockets, had initially taken up a position far too close behind the music stand, so that all they could see is the music, which must surely be annoying to his sister. But before long, heads lowered in half-loud conversation, and they retreated to the window where they remained, nervously observed by the father. It really did look all too evident that they were disappointed in their expectation of hearing some fine or entertaining playing. And they were fed up with the whole performance, and they only suffered themselves to be disturbed out of politeness. And the way they all blew their cigar smoke upwards from their noses and mouths indicated in particular a great nervousness on their part. And yet his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was inclined to the side, and sadly and searchingly her eyes followed the columns of notes. Gregor crept a little closer and held his head close to the ground so as to be prepared to meet her gaze. Could he be an animal, to be so moved by music? It was as though he sensed a way to the unknown sustenance that he longed for. He was determined to go right up to his sister, pluck at her skirt, let her know that she was come into his room with her violin, because no one rewarded music here as much as he wanted to reward it. He would not let her out of his room, at least not as long as he lived, and for the first time his frightening form would come in useful for him. He would appear at all the doors of his room at once, and he would hiss in the faces of the attackers. But his sister wasn't to be forced. She was to remain with him of her own free will. She was to sit by his side on the sofa, and he would tell her that he was resolved to send her to the conservatory, and that if the calamity hadn't struck him, he would have told everyone so last Christmas. Was Christmas past already? Surely it was. Without booking any objections. And after this declaration, his sister would burst into tears of emotion, and Gregor would draw himself up to her oxter. What's the oxter? It's a person's armpit, and kiss her on the throat, which, since she started going to the office, she wore exposed, without a collar or ribbon. "Mr. Samsa!" cried the middle of the gentleman, and not bothering to say another word, he pointed with his index finger at the slowly advancing Gregor. The violin stopped. The middle gentleman first smiled, shaking his head at his two friends, and then he looked at Gregor once more. His father seemed to think it was his first priority, even before driving Gregor away, to calm the tenants, though they were not at all agitated, and in fact they seemed to find Gregor more entertaining than they had the violin playing. He hurried over to them, and with outspread arms he tried simultaneously to push them back into their room, but with his body to block their sight of Gregor. At this point, they seemed to lose their temper. It wasn't easy to tell whether it was his father's behavior or the understanding now dawning on them they had been living next door to someone like Gregor. They called on the father for explanations. They too started waving their arms around, plucked nervously at their beards, and were slow to retreat into their room. In the meantime, Gregor's sister had overcome the confusion that had befallen her after the sudden interruption of her playing, and had, after holding her violin and bow in her slacky, hanging hands a while and continuing to read the score as if still playing, suddenly got a grip on herself and deposited the instrument in the lap of her mother, who was sitting on her chair, struggling for breath, and ran into the next room, which the tenants, yielding now to the pressure from her father, were finally more rapidly nearing. Gregor could see how, under the practiced hands of his sister, that the blankets and the pillows on the beds flew up in the air and were plumbed and pulled straight. Even before the gentlemen had reached their room, she was finished making their beds and had slipped out. Gregor's father seemed once more so much in the grip of his stubbornness that he quite forgot himself toward the tenants, and he merely pushed and pushed until the middle gentleman stamped thunderously on the floor and brought him to a stop. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and with his glare taking in his mother's sister, "that as a result of the vile conditions prevailing in this flat and in this family," here he spat emphatically on the floor, "I'm giving notice with immediate effect. I, of course, will not pay 1 cent for the days that I've lived here. In fact, I will think very carefully whether or not to proceed with, believe me, very easily substantiated claims against you." And here he stopped, and he looked straight ahead of him as though waiting for something else. And in fact, his two friends chimed in with the words, "We too are giving in our notice with immediate effect." Thereupon he seized the doorknob and slammed the door with a mighty crash. Whew. Gregor's father, with shaking hands, tottered to his chair and slumped down in it. It looked as though he were settling to his regular evening snooze, but the powerful nodding of his somehow disconnected head showed that he was very far from sleeping. And all this time, Gregor lay just exactly where he had been when the tenants despised him. Disappointment at the failure of his plan, perhaps also a slight faintness from his long fasting, kept him from being able to move, and with a certain fixed dread, he awaited with calamity about to fall upon his head. And even the violin failed to startle him when it slipped through the trembling fingers of his mother with a jangling echo fell on the floor. "Dear parents," said his sister, and brought her hand down on the table to obtain silence. "Things cannot go on like this. You might not be able to see it, but I do. I don't want to speak the name of my brother within the hearing of that monster, and so I merely say we have to try to get rid of it. We did as much as humanly possible to try and look after it and tolerate it. I don't think anyone could reproach us any measure that we haven't taken or failed to take." "She's right. 1,000 times right," his father muttered to himself, and his mother, who with an expression of disarrangement in her eyes, was still experiencing difficulty breathing, started coughing softly into her cupped hand. His sister ran over to her mother and held her by the head. The sister's words seemed to have prompted some more precise form of thought in the father's mind. And he sat up and was toying with his doorman's cap among the plates, which still hadn't been cleared after the tenant's meal, from time to time shooting a look at the silent Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," the sister now said to her father alone. As the mother was caught up in her coughing and could hear nothing, "Otherwise, it'll be the death of you. I can see it coming. If we have to work as hard as we are all at present doing, it's not possible to stand this permanent torture at home. I can't do it anymore." And she burst into a flood of tears that they flowed down onto her mother's face, from which she wiped them with mechanical movements of her hand. "My child," said the father compassionately and with striking comprehension, "but what shall we do?" Greta merely shrugged her shoulders as a sign of uncertainty into which, in striking contrast to her previous conviction, she had now fallen in her weeping. "If only he understood us," said the father with rising intonation. The sister, still weeping, waved her hand violently to indicate that such a thing was out of the question. "If only he understood us," the father repeated by closing his eyes, accepting his sister's conviction of the impossibility of it. If only then we might come to some sort of settlement with him. But as it is, we must get rid of it, cried the sister. That's the only thing for it, Father. You must have put it in your mind any thought that it's Gregor. Get it out of your thoughts. Our continuing to think that it was for such a long time, therein lies the source of our misfortune. How can it be Gregor? If it was Gregor, he would long ago have seen that it's impossible for human beings to live together with an animal like that, and he would have left of his own free will. That would have meant I didn't have to have a brother, but at least we could go on with our lives and honor his memory. But as it is, this animal hounds us. It drives away the tenants, evidently wants to take over the whole flat and throw us out onto the street. Look, Father, she suddenly broke into a scream. He's coming again. And in an access of terror, wholly incomprehensible to Gregor, his sister even quit her mother, actually pushing herself away from her chair, as though she would rather sacrifice her mother than remain anywhere near Gregor, and she dashed behind her father, who, purely on the basis of her agitation, got to his feet and half raised his arms to shield the sister. Meanwhile, Gregor, of course, didn't have the least intention of frightening anybody, and certainly not his sister. He had merely begun to turn around and make his way back to his room, which was somewhat laborious and eye-catching process as a consequence of his debility. He needed his head to help him with such difficult maneuvers, raising it many times and bashing it against the floor. Sorry. Gregor stopped and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been acknowledged, and it had just been a momentary fright that he had given them. And now they all looked at him sadly and silently. And there lay his mother in her armchair with her legs stretched out, pressed together, her eyes almost falling shut with fatigue. His father and sister were sitting side by side, and his sister having placed her hand on her father's neck. Well, maybe they'll let me turn around now, thought Gregor, and recommenced the maneuver. He was able to suppress the odd grunt of effort and needed to take periodic rests as well, but nobody interfered with him, and he was allowed to get on with it by himself. And once he had finished his turn, he straightway set off wandering back. He was struck by the great distance that seemed to separate him from his room, and he was unable to understand how, in his enfeebled condition, that he had just a little while ago covered that same distance almost without even noticing it, intent on making the most rapid progress he could. He barely noticed that no word, no exclamation from his family distracted him, and only when he was in the doorway did he turn his head, not all the way, as his neck felt a little stiff, but even so he was able to see that behind him nothing had changed, only that his sister had gotten up. His last look lingered upon his mother, who was fast asleep. And no sooner was he in his room than the door was pushed shut behind him, locked and bolted. The sudden noise so alarmed Gregor that his little legs gave way beneath him, and it was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She had been already standing on tiptoe waiting, and had then light-footedly leaped forward. Gregor didn't. He hadn't even heard her until she cried, "At last," as she turned the key in the lock. "What now?" wondered Gregor, and he looked around in the dark. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move. That surprised him. If anything, it seemed inexplicable that he had been able to get as far as he had on his frail little legs. Otherwise, he felt as well as he could be expected. He did have some pains all over his body, but he felt that they were gradually abating and would finally cease altogether. The rotten apple in his back and the inflammation all around it, well, it was entirely coated with soft dust, and he barely felt it anymore. He thought back on his family with devotion and love, and his conviction that he needed to disappear was, if anything, still firmer than his sister's. And so he remained in this condition of empty and peaceful reflection until the church clock struck 3 a.m. The last thing Gregor saw was the sky gradually lightening outside his window. And then his head involuntarily dropped, and his final breath passed feebly from his nostrils. When the charwoman came early in the morning, so powerful was she and in such a hurry, that even though she had repeatedly been asked not to, she slammed all the doors so hard that sleep was impossible after her coming in, and she at first found nothing out of the ordinary when she paid her customary brief call on Gregor. She thought that he was lying there immobile on purpose, and she was playing at being offended, because in her opinion he was capable of all sorts of understanding. Because she happened to be holding the long broom, she tried to tickle Gregor away from the doorway. But when that bore no fruit, she grew irritable, and so she jabbed Gregor with the broom. And only when she had moved him from the spot without any resistance on his part did she take notice. And when she understood what the situation was, her eyes went large and round, and she gave a half-voluntary whistle. Didn't stay any longer, but tore open the door of the bedroom and loudly called in the darkness, "Have a look! It's gone and perished. It's lying there and it's perished." The Samsons sat up in bed and had trouble overcoming their shock at the charwoman's appearance in the room, and before even beginning to register the import of what she was saying. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa hurriedly climbed out of bed, each on her own respective side, and Mr. Samsa flinging a blanket over his shoulders, and Mrs. Samsa coming along just in her nightdress, and so they stepped into Gregor's room. But by now the door from the living room had been opened as well, where Greta had slept ever since the tenants had come, and she was fully dressed, as if she hadn't slept at all. And her pale face seemed to confirm. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, and looked questioningly up at the charwoman, even though she was in a position to check it all herself, and in fact could have seen without even needing to check. "I should say so," said the charwoman, and by way of proof with her broom she pushed Gregor's body across the floor a ways. Mrs. Samsa moved as though to restrain the broom, but did not do so. "Ah," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can give thanks to God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, not taking her eye off the body, said, "Look how thin he had become. He stopped eating a long time ago. I would bring food in and took it out, and it was always untouched." Indeed, Gregor's body was utterly flat and desiccated, only so apparent now that he was no longer up on his little legs, and there was nothing else to distract the eye. Desiccated means having all the moisture removed, dried out. Got it? "Come in with us a bit, Greta," said Mrs. Samsa with a melancholy smile, and not without turning her back to look at the corpse. Greta followed her parents into the bedroom. The charwoman shut the door, opened the window as far as it would go. In spite of the early hour, there was already something sultry in the morning air. Sultry. What is sultry? Hot, humid. It was, after all, the end of March. The three tenants emerged from their room and they looked around for their breakfast in outrage. They had been forgotten about. "Where's our breakfast?" the middle gentleman sulkily asked the charwoman. She replied by setting her finger to her lips, and then quickly and silently beckoning the gentleman into Gregor's room. They followed, and with their hands in their pockets and their somewhat shiny little jackets, stood around Gregor's body in the bright, sunny room. The door from the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other, and they were all a little teary. From time to time, Greta pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my house at once," said Mr. Samsa, and he pointed to the door without relinquishing the women. How do you mean?" said the middle gentleman, with a little consternation and a smile, saccharine smile, excessively sweet. "How do you mean?" The other two kept their hands behind their backs and rubbed them together incessantly as if in the happy expectation of a great scene, which was sure to end well for them. "I mean just exactly what I said," replied Mr. Samsa, and with his two companions walked straight toward the tenants. To begin with, the tenant stood his ground and looked at the floor, as if things in his head were recombining in some new arrangement. "Well, I suppose we better go then," he said, and he looked up at Mr. Samsa as if he required authority for this novel humility. Mr. Samsa merely nodded curtly at him with wide eyes, and thereupon the gentleman did indeed swing into the hallway with long strides. His two friends had been listening for a while with their hands laid to rest, and now they skipped after him, as if afraid Mr. Samsa might get to the hallway before them and cut them off from their leader. And in the hallway, all three took their hats off the hat stand, pulled their canes out of the umbrella holder, bowed silently, and left the flat. Informed by what had turned out to be a wholly unjustified suspicion, Mr. Samsa and his womenfolk stepped out onto the landing. Leaning against the banister, they watched the three gentlemen proceeding slowly but evenly down the long flight of stairs and disappearing on each level into a certain twist of the stairway and emerging a couple of seconds later. And the further they descended, the less interest the Samsa family took in their progress. And when a butcher's apprentice passed them and eventually climbed up much higher than his tray on his head, Mr. Samsa and the women left the banister altogether and turned back with relief into their flat. They decided to use the day to rest and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they stood in dire need of a break. And so they sat down on the table and they wrote 3 separate letters of apology. Mr. Samsa to the board of his bank, Mrs. Samsa to her haberdasher, and Greta to her manager. And while they were so engaged, the charwoman came in to say that she was leaving because her morning's tasks were done. And the 3 writers at first merely nodded without looking up. And only when the charwoman made no move to leave did they look up in some irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood smiling in the doorway as though she had some wonderful surprise to tell the family about, but would only do so if she were asked expressly about it. The almost vertical ostrich feather in her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa the whole time that she had been working for them, teetered in every direction. "So what is it you want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, who was the person most likely to command respect from the charwoman. "Well," replied the charwoman, and her happy laughter kept her from speaking, "well, just to say, you don't have to worry about how to get rid of the thing next door. I'll take care of it." Mrs. Samsa and Greta inclined their heads over their letters, as if to go on writing, But Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the woman was about to embark on a more detailed description of everything, put up his hand to cut her off. Being thus debarred from speaking, she remembered with great rush that she was in, and evidently piqued, called out, "Well, so long, everybody," and spun around and left the apartment with a terrible slamming of the doors. "I'm letting her go this evening," said Mr. Samsa, but got no reply from wife or daughter, because the reference to the charwoman seemed to have disturbed their concentration, no sooner than it had returned. The two women rose and went over to the window, and they stayed there holding one another in an embrace. Mr. Samsa turned toward them in his chair and watched them in silence for a while. And then he called, "Well, now come over here. Leave that old business and pay a little attention to me." The women came straight away and caressed him, and then they finished their letters. And then all three of them left the flat, which was something that they had not done for months, and they took the tram to the park at the edge of the city. The carriage in which they sat was flooded with warm sunshine, and sitting back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects of the future. It turned out that on closer inspection, that the prospects were not so bad at all, because the work of all of them, which they had yet to talk about properly, was proceeding in a very encouraging way, particularly in regard to future prospects. The greatest alleviation of the situation must be produced by moving house. They would take a smaller, cheaper, but also better situated and more practical apartment than the present one, which Gregor had found for them. And while they were talking in these terms, almost at one and the same time, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa noticed that their increasingly lively daughter, the way of late, in spite of the trouble that they made her cheeks pale, that she had bloomed into an attractive and well-built girl. Falling silent and communicating almost unconsciously through glances, they thought it was about time to find a suitable husband for her. And it felt like confirmation of their new dreams and their fond intentions when, as they reached their destinations, their daughter was the first to get up and stretch her noble, young body. Wow. You've been reading with Jimmy. You've been reading The Metamorphosis in 5 parts by Franz Kafka. This is Jimmy. All these readings, including this part, are on my website. Hopefully you got through them all. Wasn't this a wonderful story? And I hope you go on to read the analysis. We're going to take this story apart, and I'm going to show you why it's so important, why it's a classic. And you're going to say, "Well, Jimmy, it's not going to be a classic. Nobody's a cockroach." Well, don't be too sure. Do not be too sure. Thank you for coming. Read other classics on this website. Wasn't this an enormous? I just cannot get over this story. This is an enormous story. Holy mackerel. Remember, if you have questions, comments, you can put them right here on the website. Be happy to review them. Or if you want to make it personal, email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks for coming by, and I hope you felt a little emotion when Gregor Samsa died. Take it easy. I was sorry to hear he died, but he died. Remind me of another story that we're going to read on this website if we haven't done it already. It's called Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville, the guy who wrote Moby Dick. He stopped eating too. Not Herman Melville and not Moby Dick, but Bartleby. Bartleby. Thank you very much. See ya.